All right, so good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome in from across the continent and beyond for another exciting broadcast with us here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. You know what? The class is live with us today. Some of our friends on YouTube, you guys are some of our biggest fans and audience, so you know what we're all about. But just in case, we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. This is live to YouTube. It's going to stay there forever, so you can watch it in like 3 years if you want to, and hear about your favorite day you ever had in class, hopefully. It's very exciting. Now, I typically do a sort of standard kind of introduction for people, but I'm going to throw that right out the window today because I love to read. When I was your age, if I was interested in any topic, my mom was like, let's go to the library. Let's get you all these books. Let's learn about anything you want to learn about. I would have like piles. It was a lot of fun. They're all behind me on my shelf now. So a few months back, I was reading an amazing book called Life on the Rocks by Juli Berwald. It's this incredible story of coral reefs, the scientists that help protect them all around the world, some of the most beautiful, amazing places on Earth. And because I have this awesome job, I was like, man, we need Juli on the broadcast. So I got to email Juli, and she got back instantly to be like, yes, I would love to come join. So you are in for such a treat today. She's one of the best storytellers I've ever had the chance to read. I live for science books. I read a lot of science books, and it's one of the best stories I've ever read. So it's really exciting to get to share that story with you today. She's also got another book, which is incidentally in her first slide and in my hand. I'm so excited to start literally today reading about jellyfish in her original book. So lots of excitement to go around. Can you tell? Without further ado, everyone, a big welcome to Juli joining us today. Thank you so much for coming on the broadcast, and take us away.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everybody. It's so good to be with you today. I just feel really lucky to be able to talk to all of you and tell you about my work and what I do. And thank you. Thanks for joining. I'm going to start. Well, those are my two books. And as Jesse said, my first book was about jellyfish and my second book was about coral. But how did I even get to be able to write these books? Well, I grew up really landlocked, like in the center of the country. In fact, in the most center of the country of the United States. I grew up in Missouri. We don't have an ocean for, I don't know, like 2,000 or 3,000 miles in any direction. So I never knew anything about the ocean growing up. I mean, we went on a couple vacations to the beach, but I don't really remember it being a big part of my life. And then when I went to college, I went to Israel, and I was in this program where I wasn't really very happy, to tell you the truth. I wasn't getting along too great with the other people in the class, and I was feeling sad and a little lonely, and I was just not happy. But one day I passed a wall, and there was this sign on the wall, and it said marine ecology course. And it said we could snorkel on the coral reefs. And I was like, I think I better try that because I'm not very happy where I am in my life right now. So back then there was no, email. So I actually had to pull a little, this is what it used to look like. So I pulled a little piece of paper off the wall, and I called this phone number, and I interviewed to get into the class, and I got in, and they said, meet at these buses. And so we, packed for a week and meet at these buses. And I did. And we drove through the desert, and we got out at this beach, and there were these beautiful mountains, and there was this incredible blue ocean. And I really had never been any place like that. And I'm sort of looking around, and then the teachers in the course were like, here's a snorkel and a mask and fins, put them on and get in the water. And I was like, I don't know how to, but they're like, just do it. So I did. And I put all this stuff on. I kind of tripped myself into the ocean, and I looked, and it was like this incredible world. It was full of fish, and they were all swimming around, and there was like this architecture. There were like cities underwater, and there was so much color and texture and all this life. And I couldn't believe I lived on the same planet as this world, and I had never known it before. And my mind was literally blown. Like I couldn't believe it. I got out of the water, and I was said, I'm going to be a marine biologist. And there was no reason I should have said that, but just I was so swept away by the beauty and diversity and abundance under the water. But, life doesn't go in straight lines. And so I went back to college after having this sort of amazing experience. And I said to my advisor, I'm going to become a marine biologist. And they said, you're a math major. You would have to spend another 3 years in college to become a marine biologist. And so I got kind of sad. But I still said, you know what, I'm going to try. And I started taking as many classes as I could in biology. And I got summer jobs working in marine biology labs. And eventually, I did get into a marine biology program for after college, so graduate school. Um, but I couldn't work on corals, which were what I had fallen in love with. I did work on something beautiful and colorful, which was satellite imagery of the ocean. And this was a time when we had the first satellites up in outer space, and they were looking down at the oceans for the first time. And we could start to make out all these patterns and all this really cool I guess like what you're looking at, what this map is a picture of how much photosynthesis is going on in the ocean. So photosynthesis is what plants do, right? They take sunlight and they take water and they take carbon dioxide and they mix it together through photosynthesis, and they create sugar and oxygen. And so we know trees and plants outside of our wherever we are on land, they are doing that all the time. And that's really the basis for all of the food we eat, is all of this photosynthesis. But in the ocean, it happens too, except for there aren't trees and grass and things like that. There's little single-celled plants. They're called phytoplankton. And when I went to grad school, we knew some things about phytoplankton, but we didn't realize these incredible patterns that they were making in the ocean. And the satellites helped us understand that. And so that's what I worked on for my degree in marine biology. So anyway, after that, I tried to be a scientist, but it turns out I wasn't so good at it. And I fell out of academics. I thought I was going to be a professor, but I didn't become a professor. And maybe it's because I was never quite as passionate about phytoplankton as I had been about coral. I don't know. But anyway, what I did was I became a writer. And I started writing about the oceans. And that was really awesome because I got the job. I got the opportunity to write about all kinds of really cool things. Like, these are some of my articles. I've been able to write about whale sharks, which are the biggest fish in the sea, and about regular sharks. These are actually sweet little sharks that like to live near their homes. I got to write a lot about jellyfish, which I love. And so eventually I was like, maybe I could write about coral, because that was my original love. That's what I fell in love with when I looked underwater for the first time. And so let me tell you a little bit about coral, because I was kind of nervous to write a book about coral. So this is a map of the world, and you can kind of notice all these black dots are coral reefs. And you can kind of notice that they live in the center, in the middle latitudes. They live in the middle of our planet along a belt. And that's the warmest part of the planet. It's called the tropics. And why are corals just so stuck in the middle of our planet like that? Well, this is what a coral looks like close up. A coral is a colony of little animals, I guess you could call them. They're called polyps. And each polyp is basically an upside down jellyfish, which is kind of, you can see the connection between the jellyfish and the coral. So it's tentacles, and it has a mouth in the middle, just like a jellyfish does. But instead of swimming around, it's upside down. Its tentacles are up, its mouth is facing up, and it's planted in a little cup made out of skeleton. But what's really, really amazing about coral is that inside of each little coral polyp, you can see these little golden circle things. And these little golden circle things, here's a close-up under a magnifying lens. They're here. These are algae. These are actually phytoplankton, the same thing I studied for my PhD when I was working in my degree on marine biology. And so these guys actually live inside of the coral polyp in their tissues. And what they do is photosynthesis, just like what I described before. They take carbon dioxide, they take water, they take sunlight, they mix it up and they make sugar, which they feed to the coral. And the coral lives on that sugar. And the little algae, or they are called, a lot of people call them zooxanthellae, which is a long word, but they feed almost all, 95% of the sugar that they make straight to the coral. And that is so much energy. It's like super fuel for the coral. And with that super fuel, the coral can make their skeleton, which is basically rock. It's like limestone. And that limestone they use to make the reefs, the great reefs of our planet. And they are so big, we can see them from outer space. And these reefs are so important to our oceans. About a quarter of all marine animals rely on these reefs at some point in their life. It's supposed to be around 1 million species. We don't know how many species live in the ocean, so it's hard to say exactly, but about 1 million species of animals rely on coral reefs around the world for their life because they are actually like little cities with places for lots of animals to live and grow or lay their eggs or whatever they're doing. So coral are incredibly important. They have a bigger importance than just the little animals themselves because they create this architecture, these cities for all these other animals. But here's the thing. And this is why I really was worried about writing this book about corals. Like I said, so healthy coral, they're the animals, the polyps, the coral polyps with their little algae inside. There's zooxanthellae inside that are photosynthesizing and feeding them sugar and everything's good. But when a coral gets stressed, the algae will leave the coral. And when they leave, they take their color, that little golden color I showed you, that leaves them and the coral become clear. And all you can see is the white skeletons underneath. And that's called coral bleaching. And so when the algae leave the coral, they aren't just taking their color, they're taking all that sugar that they make too. So all of a sudden the coral is starving. It's not getting the sugar that it needs for the fuel that keeps it alive. And one of the major reasons why coral bleach is from heat. And as you probably know, our planet is heating up. And so this heat from climate change is affecting coral all over the world. And it's already half the coral reefs on our planet have bleached. And the algae will come back and recolonize the coral if the water temperature lowers. And that happens sometimes. But if it doesn't, if the water stays too warm, the coral will actually starve to death. And so it's really a tough time out there for coral. And that was one of the things I was worried about writing this book, because I didn't want to write a book that was just a very, very sad story about coral struggling to live. And when a coral reef bleaches, this is what it looks like. It just looks like a bunch of bones out there in the ocean. There's another thing happening with coral, which is that there's a lot of diseases spreading around. And currently, this is a really serious disease. This is a map. So here's Florida right here. And this is the Gulf of Mexico. This is Mexico here. And here's Belize and Guatemala and Honduras. And then this is sort of the rest of the Caribbean islands. And you can see these little red dots are places where this disease called stony coral tissue loss disease has been noticed. And it's spreading throughout the Caribbean, and it's a very serious disease. This is what it looks like when it infects a coral. It basically causes the tissue to die on the coral very quickly. And we don't know what's causing this disease. We don't know if it's a bacteria or a fungus or something else. but it is killing coral at a really fast rate. And so it's not just bleaching, but it's also diseases that are affecting corals. And like I said, this is a really hard story. This was going to be a really hard story for me to write because I didn't want to write just the sad things. But I wanted to try to think about what it would mean to write a book about coral. And so I started like looking at, Googling like you do when you want to start learning about something. And I found a meeting in Florida, and it was called Reef Futures. And this was back in 2018. And I'm like, Reef Futures, well, that sounds positive because we're talking about like, what will the future of the coral reef look like? And I started reading a lot of the stories, the titles of the presentations that were going to be at this meeting. And a lot of them sounded really positive and really creative and innovative, ideas that maybe could help protect coral. And so I went to this meeting, and what I found were lots of people who weren't ready to say it's over for the coral. They were ready to say, let's roll up our sleeves. Let's think about what we can do to help protect coral. And so those are some of the stories I want to share with you today. And one of the most incredible ones was from this place called Sulawesi in Indonesia. And so here's another little map. You can see, maybe not so great. I hope you can see it okay enough, but here's the equator. And here's where Indonesia is. It's actually in a part of the world called the Coral Triangle. So here's the Philippines. This is Indonesia, and this is a place called Papua New Guinea. And you can see how it sort of makes a triangle. And that coral triangle is where most of the coral on our planet live. There are 800 species of coral that live there. And that compares to like in the Caribbean, there's probably around 60 or so species. So a lot more species of coral live in this place called the Coral Triangle. So this is a really great place to work on coral because you've got so many of them living there. And that place, this project is actually put on, like it's funded, and all the research comes from the Mars candy bar company. So those Skittles that you might have eaten at Halloween time, and I don't know if anyone eats Mars that much anymore, but like Milky Ways, that company actually is behind this restoration project, this project for coral. And where they work is this place called Sulawesi, and this is what the island looks like. We are actually working back here behind this little branch of the island, and what you can see is that it's a pretty shallow place. There's these islands that are very low lying. They're not like big hilly or anything like that. Lots of people live on these islands. What's really incredible is there's no water on these islands. And so they have to ship in, they have to bring ferries all the time to bring in their water and to take away their garbage. So it's a tough life. But you can see that surrounding these islands are these coral reefs. That's what's in the water here. The problem is that a lot of the coral reefs look like this. And that's because there is an illegal fishing practice there called blast fishing, where people will throw bombs into the ocean that explode. And when they do, they stun the fish, and then it's easier to pick up the fish and sell them. But it also destroys the coral reef. And this reef was bombed 30 years ago. So you can see that it does not recover once it's bombed. But the Mars people have developed this really cool system that are called reef stars, and they're made out of rebar, which is something you can use to like reinforce concrete when you're building a new building. So it's available all over the world, and it's covered in sand so that the coral feel like they know how to grip onto it. And so these are all little coral fragments that are attached on with zip ties. And you can see these are fishermen who are working to create the restoration. So you put the coral on here, and then you bring these reef stars underwater, and then they're all attached together into sort of like a honeycomb or like a galaxy of reef stars. And you can see the little pieces of coral that have been attached onto these structures. And then what happens is you just let them grow. And because the reef is stabilized and because you've put coral in place, a year and a half later, it looks like this. And you can still see the little reef stars underneath. You can see the pieces of the reef stars still, but the coral have started to really grow back into a reef. And then about 3 years later, you can't even see the reef stars anymore. And the reef is fully recovered. And I missed it, but a big sea turtle just had swam out of this picture before it was taken. So this is a really alive and functioning and restored reef. And so this is really, really hopeful that if we work, we can actually bring reefs back to life. In the Caribbean, where I said there are fewer species of coral, they're doing this other thing, which is growing orchards of coral on these sort of PVC pipes underwater. And they will grow them and then take little fragments of these and plant them back on the reef. And hundreds and thousands of little fragments have been glued back on the reefs in the Caribbean. And the other thing they're doing in the Caribbean is catching they're working to take baby corals and put them back on the reef. So this is a coral that is releasing its eggs. Those little dots are little eggs of coral. And coral are really cool because, they can't get up and walk around and find a partner, or they can't swim around and find a partner. So what they do is they release their eggs on a certain night in the summertime. It will be after the full moon. So they'll use the full moon as a clock. And then after sunset, a certain number of hours, each species will release its eggs into the water, and then they will float around, and hopefully they won't get eaten by all the things that are out there. And then they turn into little larvae, and they float down, they swim down, and they plant themselves on the reef and hopefully grow into a new colony. But in the Caribbean, people are giving them a little help with that. And they're catching the eggs and putting them in these little coral coral cribs, they're calling them, where they can swim down safely onto these little kind of tinker toy looking things and find a place to plant themselves. And they like to live sort of in nooks and crannies, and they grow their very first little polyp and their very first little skeleton. And once they get kind of big enough that they won't get eaten by other things, they can be put back onto the reef and hopefully grow up into big colonies. And here I'm looking at some of the baby corals that have settled onto these little bricks that are inside of these cribs. And this is off of the Dominican Republic, which is in the Caribbean. And then there's another thing that people are doing. And this is a really interesting idea. And it's kind of very different from the other ideas, which are sort of about nurturing the coral themselves. This is the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. And here is the corner of Australia. And all of these dots are the Great Barrier Reef. It is the biggest coral reef in the world. If you took this reef and you laid it across like the west coast of the United States, it would stretch from Vancouver in Canada down to Tijuana in Mexico. So it's huge. It's the size, it's the size of Italy. It's just a massive, massive reef made out of, if you think about it, it's so cool. Those little teeny polyps that are the size of a pencil eraser have created this massive, massive coral reef. And for whatever reason, the Great Barrier Reef had never undergone a bleaching until around 2016. And then you can see this red shows where the coral reef bleached. And then it bleached again the very next year in 2017. And then it bleached again in 2020. And so the Australian government said, this is very serious, and we need to really think about all the ways that we can protect our coral. And we're going to do everything we can because this is just a real treasure on our planet. And so they are doing things like what I've already shown you, where they're restoring the reef using structures like reef stars. they're catching babies. They're also they're doing all kinds of research into how to create coral that can survive in hotter water. But they're also doing this thing that no one else is doing. And this is what it looks like. So this is a boat and it's on the reef. And this machine is taking seawater and puffing it out and making tiny, tiny, tiny droplets. And those tiny, tiny droplets have just a little bit of salt in them. And those droplets float up to the clouds and they add salt to the clouds. And why would you want to do that? Well, it turns out salt can act, so clouds are made out of little droplets of water, right? So if you add salt to the clouds, the water will come and like circle the little salt droplets, and the clouds become brighter. They become whiter. And that reflects sunlight away from the reef. So you're actually kind of adding glitter to the clouds, and you're reflecting the sunlight away from the reef. And when that sunlight is reflected away, the reef doesn't warm up as much and it stays cooler. And so this is called cloud brightening, and it's an idea that they're testing to hopefully keep the reef cooler so that it doesn't bleach. And it's a really innovative idea, and they're the only ones that are trying this. So ultimately, what we really need to do is work on climate change to protect the coral reefs. And we're doing it a little bit. So this is a graph, and what it's showing here is how much carbon dioxide we're emitting. And carbon dioxide holds heat, and that's why our planet's warming up. And before we got really concerned about climate change, so here, this kind of represents time on the bottom of this graph. And right here is 2020, and here is 2100. And before we started talking about climate change, we knew carbon dioxide was increasing, and that was increasing the heat of our planet. And we were on track to really add a lot of carbon dioxide to our atmosphere and a lot of heat. And if we would have done this by 2100, there really wouldn't be any coral reefs left. It would be too hot on our planet for them. But because we've started to think about it and work about it, currently we're doing something. We're decreasing how much carbon dioxide is going into the atmosphere. We've promised, this pledged line shows that we've promised to actually decrease it even more, and maybe we'll get there. We need to do even better, because this blue line shows where the scientists think we need to be. I don't know if we're gonna get all the way there, but hopefully we'll get closer, because that's what really needs to happen to protect our coral reefs. And the good news is that there are some reefs that still seem to be doing really, really well out there. So this is a reef I was able to dive on. I'm from Texas, and these reefs are 100 miles offshore of Texas, and they are some of the healthiest reefs that are left on our planet. This is me diving on them. The coral there are so big. They're thousands of years old, and they're so healthy. The bleaching and the diseases that are affecting other coral don't seem to be affecting these reefs. And so it's just amazing. I've also been able to dive in this place called Tela Honduras, where I don't know why, but the coral there are also just doing incredibly well. They are super healthy. These coral are an endangered species, and there's fields of them. And you can see how beautiful and rich this reef looks. So there are stories of us helping coral. There are stories of resilience, and there are stories of us actually starting to take climate change seriously. And all of these things inspire me and make me hope that in the future, we will have healthy coral reefs. And I guess I'll stop there for now and let you guys ask me questions and see what happens next.
Fantastic, Julie. What an amazing story. And so nice to end with such a hopeful message. This is the thing that we harp on in a lot of our programs, whether it's biodiversity loss or climate change. These are big issues. These are things that you've heard about as classes. Your parents talk about them, perhaps. They're on the news every day. And yet, there's so much reason for hope and optimism, in part because there's incredible people all around the globe working to make a positive difference. This is something we speak to in a lot of our programs. And you as kids know this better than anyone. There's never been a more involved generation ever for speaking up, for talking to representatives, for marching in groups of hundreds of thousands. It's an amazing time to be a kid with these big challenges, but also so much optimism for change. So, Julie, that was extraordinary. And as you said, we're going to dive in with questions. YouTubers, feel free to chime in the chat. We'd love to take as many from you as possible. But I'm going to start with you in Texas with Miss Hance's class, Grisham Middle School. If you guys want to come in and kick us off, we'll start with you. And then we'll head to our Jerusalem Elementary and Miss Canalte's class, Reefs. Hi, sixth graders. Welcome in.
Come up here. Quick.
Run! Oh, no, you're good. Take your time. Take your time.
There you go. Push down.
You said that some coral reefs are endangered.
Yes.
Why is that?
Because of the warming oceans, because of climate change is really the biggest issue. When we burn fossil fuels, we release carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide holds heat, and the heat is bad for that symbiosis that I was talking about between the coral and the algae that lives in its tissue and feeds it all that sugar. So that's the big, really big issue.
Yeah, they're interesting. I mean, we actually had an Arctic program earlier today talking about polar bears. And polar bears and coral, I think, are the two animals or groups that are the most sort of icons of climate change. Like, as we continue to get warmer, they're sort of indicator species or reefs that highlight this as a challenge. So I'm really glad we let off with that question. Thanks, guys. Miss Cullen's class, Jerusalem Elementary, if you want to come in and unmute your mic, I'm coming to you, and then Miss Swang's to next. Come on in, folks. Hey.
What is the biggest coral reef you've been in?
Yeah, the Great Barrier Reef is the biggest reef. Like I said, it's so big. It's the size, it's the size of the whole west coast of the United States plus a little. It is made up of 3,000 smaller reefs, and it's just massive. The number 2 biggest reef is the reef off of Mexico down through Belize and Guatemala and Honduras. That's called the Mesoamerican Reef. And so the Great Barrier Reef is about 1,400 miles long. The Mesoamerican Reef is around 680 miles long. And then the third biggest reef is off the coast of Florida down into the Florida Keys, and that's about 300 miles long.
Very, very cool. Thanks, Julie. By the way, I don't know how your computer's set up, but if you can't see us, make sure you can exit screen share and come back to see us anytime you want. And if you can't see us, great.
Okay.
Yeah. Feel free to exit screen share. Come and see us. I would want to make sure. That's awesome.
Okay.
Take your time doing that.
Let's see.
There we are. Perfect. We're back. Nice. More fun to see the kids. Miss Swangstu's class, you guys have the whiteboard as always, but welcome in Jerusalem. Hi.
Does a coral reef ever die because of their age?
Oh my gosh, I love that question so much. You know what? I don't think we know how old coral can really live. Because it's a colony, it's constantly growing new polyps on the outside. And there are some corals that are 2,000 years old, probably. And I don't think we know if a coral can really die exactly. So it's a pretty great question. When something's a colony, actually, this was a huge debate among scientists about 100 years ago. What is a colony, like an individual like we are, or is it something else? Because it can always make new versions of itself by budding. So could it ever die? It's a really hard and kind of cool philosophical question.
It is. You've stumped the expert. And this is something that we've never had that question in any of our coral programs ever. But it's where sort of the boundaries of life blur. Again, polar bear, I mentioned, a polar bear, a person, we're an individual with fungal networks, or like a community of trees that are connected by their roots, or coral. Like these are great examples of things that don't fit into our sort of standard way of thinking. So what an amazing question, guys.
I love it.
Yeah, Miss Canaldi's class. I'm heading to you guys. I'm going to take a few from YouTube after that, and then we're going to do a whole second round. But Julie, you're whipping through these. These are great.
Okay.
Come on in, Miss Canaldi. Hi.
Has the Great Barrier Reef ever been like attacked by like the crown of thorn starfish?
Yes.
Starfish outbreak?
Yes, that is a very, very big problem on the Great Barrier Reef. The crown of thorn starfish, which great picture. They are like these crazy massive starfish that are like the size of a dinner plate, and they have tons and tons of arms, and they like cruise. They eat coral. Coral's their favorite food, and they cruise along the reef in these massive hordes, like a herd of wildebeests or something, and they just plow through the coral, and it's a very, very serious problem for the Great Barrier Reef. And it seems like they come sort of in cycles. So there'll be like a few years where there's just too many crown of thorn starfish to imagine, and then they kind of go down and they come back again. But there's very active programs on the Great Barrier Reef to kill the crown of thorn starfish because they're so damaging. And as our ecosystems become, a little bit off balance, that gives an edge up to the crown of thorns. So that's why they have these programs to really like take them off the reef.
No. Yeah. Well, no, honestly, culling some animals to help protect ecosystems, especially if they're in overabundance or if they've been introduced, is a really common conservation strategy. So I'm glad you highlighted this.
Yeah.
And I can find a clip of this actually. So BBC has an amazing little 3.5-minute clip of that sort of action. Way to go doing your research in advance of the program, guys. That was awesome.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, we're going to head to Miss McCool's class on YouTube, and then Grisham Middle School. We're coming straight back to you. They wanted to know what area of the world has reefs that are suffering the most. Is there sort of like a ground zero for bad reef impacts?
Yeah, you know what? Unfortunately, it's right here in the United States. I think probably the Florida Reef Tract is really, really suffering. They've been swept by a lot of diseases. The actual numbers are very hard. About 1 to 2% of the coral are left in the Florida Reef Tract. So it's definitely been hit hard by bleaching and by disease. And it's hard to say those numbers, but even with just 1 to 2% left of the coral, there's still a lot of coral. Like that's the thing, like coral, the reefs are so big. It's hard for us to really get our mind around it. So even with 1 to 2% left, there still is coral. So there still is something to protect. And I don't want to say it's like completely over, but it is a tough situation there.
Great question, Ms. McCool's class. We're going to head back to Grisham Middle School. We'll do another round with everyone. Mr. Holden, we've got you on YouTube as well. There's so many kids. It's just hard to even keep track. Come on back in Austin. Hi. Come on up, man.
Who inspired you the most?
Oh, that's so hard. I don't know if I have a the most, because I like getting inspiration from lots of places. I would say my parents were huge inspirations for me. I did say that we never really went to the beach growing up, but we were outside. My dad was a big rock hound. He loved collecting rocks. So every summer we drove around the country and like collected rocks, and we were outside in nature all the time. And I got to see just how amazing this planet is and how beautiful it is and how much there is to wonder at. And I think that was probably one of my biggest inspirations. And then in terms of, I also love reading, like, I'm like Jesse, like I was one of the people who had like the stack of books from the library all the time. So I got to hand it to my librarians for pointing me in the right directions to read all these great books growing up.
My wife's a librarian, so I'm very biased, but go talk to your librarian. They're the best. You find the coolest stuff ever. Miss Cullen, we're going to head to you, and then we'll take Mr. Holden's online, and Miss Swanks to Miss Canaldi to wrap up after that. So much fun. You guys are an amazing audience today, so a huge thank you to all of you. Miss Cullen, come on in and take us away. Hey.
What was the coolest thing you've ever seen diving?
No pressure.
I mean, I don't know. Like cuttlefish are super cool if you ever run across a cuttlefish. But I guess, you know what? Actually, the coolest thing was like really the first time I saw coral reef, which I described to you guys. And then the other coolest thing was I was in the Dominican Republic, that picture I showed where the coral were releasing their eggs into the water. And what it feels like is like being in a reverse snowstorm. So like all of the eggs are coming out of the coral, but they're floating upwards. They're all floating upwards. So like it's like all of these little white, almost like snowflakes, but they're all going up. And so the world feels like you're in this reverse blizzard. And then what happens is the animals know that, like we like to eat eggs, animals in the ocean like to eat eggs too, because they're full of good protein and good fats and stuff. And so all these animals show up to come eat all of the eggs as they're floating up. And there's all these crazy jellyfish and things called siphonophores and salps and pyrosomes and all these like strange marine animals that are incredibly beautiful, but like they don't get a lot of play in our like most of our nature and science shows. And they all show up to eat these eggs. And so the world is just like buzzing, but you're in a reverse snowstorm, and it's an incredible experience.
So when people don't mention coral spawning, I always work it into every coral broadcast. It's the coolest thing ever. Everybody should go look up coral breeding or coral spawning when you're done this broadcast. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. But also cuttlefish are amazing. Everyone should go check out cuttlefish. Quick question from our YouTube friends, and then Ms. Swanks, we're coming to you. Mr. Holden wants to know, what temperature does coral grow or thrive at? Do we have a sort of temperature range or anything that jumps out?
Okay, this is going to be tough for me because scientists always talk in Celsius temperatures. So I'm going to try to do, and let me just say, like I said, there are 800 species of coral in the Pacific alone. So each species sort of has the range that it likes to live at. There are more northern species, and there are more southern species, and and more more kind of equatorial species, and those ones like the hotter water, and the ones at the edge of the range, the north and the south, like the cooler water. But coral will live around, I think maybe 78 to 87, something like that. Fahrenheit, 27 to 31 Celsius is around there. The water, in Florida this summer got up to 34, which was like in the 90s, and that's way too hot for coral.
Yeah, I'm. By the way, these sort of questions are always really tricky. So well done. I was doing this as you were talking about it. So yes, sort of optimal seems to be like high 70s, low 80s in Fahrenheit, comparably in Celsius, of course. So look that up. But we have some cold water corals too, which we featured some cool broadcasts on in the past, which are really neat. If it's too cold, there's no corals off Antarctica. And there's no corals in bath water when it gets to be 100 degrees Fahrenheit, because it's pretty much bad for everything. So,
but there are these amazing deep sea corals that grow super slowly, and they do live in cold water. And so that's like a whole nother, y'all need to do a whole nother show on the cold water corals, because they're so cool.
We're gonna anytime. Put me in touch. We'll make it happen. All right, we're going to rip through two more questions. Thanks for sticking around, everybody. Miss Swanks's class, and then Miss Canaldi to wrap up. Come on in, Jerusalem Elementary. Hi.
How many years does it take to fix coral?
Oh, I'm sorry. How many years does it take
to fix coral?
Fix coral.
Fix.
Oh, it doesn't take as long as you would think. So it probably takes 3 years to, like I showed you that picture, going from like the bombed out, like nothing there, to like a full coral reef. And that took 3 years. So you can do it. It happens faster than you think, which is amazing and so hopeful.
It is truly, you showed me that picture in the presentation. I saw it in your book, and that is unbelievable. There's basically no conservation success that you can have in that level of speed. So it gives tons of hope for coral reefs. Like if we just take action, if we do what we do to replant forests, coral come back and the fish come back. It becomes this incredible ecosystem very speedily. So I love that question. Thank you, Ms. Banks, too. Ms. Kinaldi, we're going to wrap up with you. Time flies and you're having fun. I will message everyone with a really cool Kahoot to follow this up with on coral that we did with Dr. Jennifer Matthews in the past. And of course, I'll highlight Julie's amazing book so you can check out her website and more when we're done. So much learning to keep going when you're done this broadcast. But come on in and take us away, grade 5. Hi.
Do coral eat, sleep, and drink?
Ooh.
Great question. They definitely, okay, so coral actually don't have to eat because they have those algae living inside their tissue that feed them sugar. But they do have those tentacles that I showed you, and they do eat. And so they have little stinging cells, just like jellyfish do. They're actually first cousins, and the stinging cell is what makes them first cousins. And so they can sting little teeny like zooplankton, which are like little teeny shrimp and stuff. And they put them in their mouth and they eat. And they were starting to understand that coral that eat more may be healthier and may be able to survive the warming waters, the bleaching better. So there's some evidence showing that eating may be good for coral, even though they don't have to. When they eat, they maybe are healthier. Do they drink? Not really. No, I guess they really don't drink because they're sort of surrounded by water. So they don't drink the same way we have to drink because we're surrounded by air. And do they sleep? You know, it's interesting. They definitely cycle through day and night. So a lot of coral during the day, they have their tentacles pulled in and their bodies are kind of hunkered down inside their skeleton. And then at night, they open up and they stretch their tentacles out and they eat. So I'm not sure if they're sleeping during the day exactly, but they're definitely doing something different during the day than at night. And maybe they are sleeping a little bit. So like I said, jellyfish are first cousins of the corals. And it turns out if jellyfish, it looks like they will sleep. And if you give them, there's something called melatonin, which we release at night when we sleep. It helps us sleep. And if you give a jellyfish melatonin, it will sleep. It will stop. It will settle down on the seafloor and kind of get quiet and sleep. So maybe corals are doing the same thing.
I've never heard that in my life.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for teaching me something new, Julie. Classes, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate your energy, enthusiasm, amazing questions, and more. I'll make sure you get all the links to keep the learning going when this is done. There's so much more to explore on coral, so stay tuned for all that. Julie, thank you for joining us for the first time ever. We'll have to have you back as soon as you're willing to come be with us again. And what we do to end every broadcast, I'm going to bring in all our classes to say a ridiculously over the top thank you and farewell. So Grisham Middle School, Miss Cullen's class, Miss Swangshue's class, Miss Penalty's class, YouTubers at home, thank you so much, everybody.